Hi friends, welcome to Beautifully Bookish Bethany. In today's video, we're going to be talking about fantasy books for every mood. It's no secret that fantasy is one of my favorite genres, and I really want to share it with all of you. There's so much breadth to the genre of fantasy. There's so many different subgenres for different people's tastes, and I really think anybody can find a fantasy book that is going to work for them. Some of the benefits of fantasy are it allows for imagination and escapism and thinking about things from a different perspective, but we have it for every mood. So in this video, we're going to be talking about 3 different categories of fantasy books, and I'm going to give you a few recommendations in each category. These categories are cozy fantasy, dark fantasy, and epic adventure fantasy. Cozy fantasy has really been having a moment in the last few years. Now, this can include a variety of kinds of books. It might include books with relatively low stakes, where the conflict isn't world-ending or epic. It might also include stories that are relatively small and contained, where you keep revisiting the same location or some of the same characters over time. Or it might be the kind of book that you could imagine reading aloud to your kids, and it's a bit of a warm hug or something kind of comforting. There are different degrees and levels of cozy fantasy. I personally really love it, and I have 4 recommendations for you today, and they're gonna have a bit of a range of how high the stakes get. We'll start with the one with the lowest stakes. That book is Legends and Lattes by Travis Baldree. The main criticism I hear of this book is the fact that it's low stakes, so this may not be up everybody's alley, but if you always wanted to read something in a fantasy world where a retired, battle-weary orc decides to start a coffee shop and maybe falls in love along the way, this is the book for you. It's a book that I read early on in the COVID-19 pandemic and found to be really comforting. She's making incredible discoveries, like the possibility of putting ice in coffee. Shocking. This is quite literally the day-to-day process of building a coffee shop, getting to know some of the customers that are coming into it, but it's set in a fantasy world. So I would say that this is the most low stakes, very cozy book in this category. My next recommendation, the stakes are upped a little more. It's still really comforting and is a smaller story. This is The Spell Shop by Sarah Beth Durst. I adore this. This follows a librarian of magical books who is escaping a political coup on the mainland and illegally takes a bunch of the books under her care back to the small island where she was raised. And there she opens a jam shop as a cover for the magic spell shop that she's actually running. And there's a lot of really cozy moments of her being in this small town, interacting with the townspeople who are really quaint, falling in love with a childhood friend that she re-meets, but there are also some real stakes where there is fear of getting found out or getting discovered by the government because she's not actually supposed to be there. This was delightful, and if you want to try cozy fantasy, it's a great option. My next suggestion is Tress of the Emerald Sea by Brandon Sanderson. I think what's important to know about this, in some ways it's a retelling of The Princess Bride, but what if Buttercup didn't sit at home, but she went off and did something to save herself and save the person that she loves? That's what this is. But of course, because it's Brandon Sanderson, it's set in a world that has a lot of bigger ideas, interesting world building where they sail on seas of spores that can be incredibly dangerous, and Tress is the sweet island girl who loves to collect teacups, but ends up going on a journey that she never expected. I love this so much. It's the kind of book I could see returning to, reading aloud to my kids, and it's just really comforting. It has a happy ending, and I find this very cozy. My final suggestion for this category is a series of novellas. And while some of the individual novellas can get a bit dark in terms of the topics that they're tackling and some of what happens to the characters, overall, I find this series to be really cozy and comforting. There's a repetition to it and a return to location, return to characters that we know and love, and you kind of know that for the most part, things are going to work out okay in the end. For the most part. This is the Wayward Children series by Seanan McGuire. The first novella is Every Heart a Doorway, and this is about children who find magical doors into other worlds and then come back to our world and struggle to readjust and end up going to the school for wayward children. So It's an interesting novella series because they're all interconnected. Some of them are set in this timeline connected to the school directly. Some of them are prequels where some of the different children we meet in the school, we eventually learn their backstory. I love every single book in this series, and while some of them can get dark, ultimately I think they're pretty hopeful, and I would say that that works as cozy. Next, we're going to take a hard turn and talk about dark fantasy. When I think about dark fantasy, I'm thinking of a few different things. Some of this is heavier themes, themes of war, themes of oppression, not necessarily happy endings, often tragic or brutal things happening. And sometimes these are also low magic worlds, where if there is magic, there's not very much of it, but it is still considered fantasy. Again, I have 4 recommendations for you, and I really love all of these. I think they're fantastic, but they are harder hitting. They often have heavier subject matter, or as in the case of one series I'm going to recommend, are doing some things to subvert typical approaches to fantasy. My first recommendation for a dark fantasy book is the Poppy War series by R.F. Kuang. This is military fantasy inspired by Chinese history, and boy does it get dark. In the first half of this book, we follow a young woman who goes to a military academy, and she is determined to be as good as any man, but then the country goes to war about halfway through the book, and we're dealing through the rest of the story with the brutality of war, with atrocities and war crimes that are described pretty graphically, and with issues of addiction and drug use and PTSD, but with magic mixed in as well. So again, not a happy series, definitely intense, hard-hitting, drawing on some real-world history, but incredibly written and really powerful. Next, I of course have to recommend what is one of my favorite fantasy series of all time, and that is the Broken Earth trilogy by N.K. Jemisin. The first book in this series is the 5th season. This is set in a dystopian world where every few thousand years there's what's called a season, where these earthquakes and tectonic shifts create almost unlivable conditions for humans, and this is set at the beginning of the 5th season. We're following characters who are dealing with a huge amount of oppression. They have magical abilities that are often tightly controlled by the government. They're trying to survive, and we're also dealing with trauma surrounding parenthood and loss of a child. Not light fare, but I think this entire series is absolutely brilliant, and the way that in the second and third book it starts to introduce some sci-fi elements, y'all, I cannot get over this series. I've reread it a couple of times. I'm sure I will do it again in the future. Cannot recommend this enough, but it is on the dark side. My next recommendation is one that I think is really underhyped. Not enough people know about this book or have read it, but I thought it was fantastic. This is Masquerade by Oo Sengoyomi. This is African-inspired, very low magic fantasy that is loosely a retelling of Hades and Persephone, but without the underworld. So we're following a young woman who is kidnapped by a king who wants to make her his bride. She is forced into marriage with him and slowly finds a way to retake power, and will be pretty vicious in the way that she does it. I think this is a really interesting take on the Hades and Persephone myth, because while it doesn't have this underworld element, it gives back agency to the female main character, even if it's in a fairly dark way. This is not a romance. A lot of Hades and Persephone retellings these days are romances. This is not. It is a dark fantasy that is very low magic, but it is so great. And it's a debut, which I found really impressive. My final recommendation for this category, if you know, you know, I've got to recommend The First Law Universe by Joe Abercrombie. He literally on social media, he is Lord Grimdark, and what he's doing in this universe, Blade itself begins the first trilogy, A Little Hatred begins a later trilogy. You could start either place. I would recommend here, but you also could start here and then go back. Just a very different approach to doing it. There's a lot of books in this world, but they are all well worth reading. What I think is really interesting about what he does is it's subverting typical fantasy tropes and the concept of heroes. Pretty much everybody's morally gray to bad, depending on who they are. There truly are no heroes. Everybody's very human and very flawed and often selfish, but there are some amazing characters in these books. His character work is incredible, and the payoff, if you read series to their end, the way that he pulls things together is just chef's kiss. Incredible. Cannot recommend enough. Again, this is dark fantasy. It's not happy, but it is really great. Lastly, let's talk about the classic epic adventure fantasy. This is what you think of when you probably think of fantasy, and in fact I am going to include one of the classics in this because it's always worth talking about and worth revisiting, and that of course is The Lord of the Rings by J.R.R. Tolkien. I feel like this is one of the pivotal key texts that really pushed the fantasy genre forward. There was fantasy prior to this, but I mean, you really can't beat Lord of the Rings, and it stands the test of time. This is an epic adventure. There is a dark lord. There are unlikely heroes. There are so many twists and turns and incredible characters. It is so good. Now, to be fair, the books have a lot of songs. Tolkien liked to write songs. Not everybody likes them. I don't mind them. There are a lot of those. The Peter Jackson films are incredible, but the books are also amazing and have so much added depth and nuance to them. So this is a classic trilogy that is definitely worth revisiting. My next recommendation for this category is the Witcher series by Andrzej Sapkowski. You might be familiar with this because of the video game or the TV show, but first, before there was all of that, there were the books. They have been translated from their original Polish. I read them in English, and they're really good and really interesting. The scale of these is epic. There's a lot of intricate court politics and geopolitical systems that he is exploring in these books, but we also have these phenomenal, memorable characters like Geralt and Ciri, and their unlikely relationships with each other, the monster hunting. The Last Wish is the first short story collection that kicks off the series, and it's really great. This first short story collection is kind of fun because a lot of the stories are actually darker retellings of fairy tales, but featuring Geralt as the main character and set in this fantasy world. So you're getting plenty of epic adventure, heroics, and lots of politics and lovable characters. I absolutely recommend this series. I also couldn't make this video without recommending that you try the Realm of the Elderlings books by Robin Hobb. This is a set of interconnected series set in the same universe. I've read almost all of them. I have a final trilogy left to read because they're not small books, so I've been savoring them and tackling them bit by bit. But the first book is Assassin's Apprentice, and Robin Hobb is a genius. The level of detail in the world building, the way that she builds characters who feel so real and so human, and the way that she likes to tear your heart out by having tragic, awful things happen to her characters because that's the way things are in real life. I mean, don't expect these books to be cozy and have happy endings, but you will get very attached to some of the characters, and this includes some of the animals. In Assassin's Apprentice, we're following a young boy who is a bastard of a prince who's passed away, and he is now being raised in the king's keep. But he has this strange affinity for animals, and there is magic in this world. The second series in this world is the Live Ship Traders, which I also love. This is controversial. People have their favorites, but again, epic adventure, tragedy that will tear your heart out, incredible characters, heroic, and ultimately I would say pretty hopeful, even though things do get worse before they get better. So if you haven't tried the Realm of the Elderling series by Robin Hobb, I absolutely would recommend. My final suggestion is for those of you who are ready to take on a challenge, because this series is not for the faint of heart. I would not recommend this for readers who are new to the fantasy genre, but if you are a seasoned fantasy reader and you think that you can handle complexity, then you really should try the Chorus of Dragons series by Jen Lyons. The first book is The Ruin of Kings, and this is epic fantasy with politics and messy characters, but it is one of the most complicated series that I've ever read because The magic system involves mechanisms for body hopping and reincarnation. So tracking who people are when they're in different bodies or have been reincarnated into a different identity can get very complicated and messy, and there are a lot of moving pieces in this series. There's a lot of players, there's sort of gods walking among us and getting messily involved in human lives, power-hungry people looking for crowns, messy romantic relationships. There's also quite a number of queer characters in these books, so if you're looking for that kind of representation, you'll find them here. But it is brilliant. It is a very satisfying series. It is complete. All 5 books are out, so you can read it all and have a finished series. But again, I do warn you, it's complicated and you have to pay close attention, but it is really good. So there you go, 12 recommendations for different flavors or subgenres of fantasy. Again, fantasy is this big umbrella that has so many different kinds of books within it. Whether you're looking for something cozy, something dark, something epic and heroic, there is something for everyone. Talk to me in the comments down below. Let me know any of your thoughts. If you reached this point in the video, leave me a dragon emoji because we do love a good dragon. Leave that for me in the comments down below. And let me know, what is your favorite fantasy book, or what kind of fantasy book are you looking for? Is there a category of fantasy that I didn't mention here, a subgenre I didn't mention that you think that I should do in a future video? Let me know in the comments down below. If you like this video, it always helps if you give it a thumbs up. Subscribe if you want to see more. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.